Hello, welcome to today's talk by Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to talk about transits or Gochara for July of 2022. And again, this is based on Vedic astrology or the astrology of ancient India. Excuse me. And the general theme for the month, I think, is going to be integrating head and heart for a new start. So it even rhymes, isn't that cute? Before we get too far along, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. And if you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And then I would take a minute or two to read the rest of this note here. So, this is just a summary of the dates of different important transits going on in July of 2022. So, July 2nd, that's today, Mercury enters Gemini, or has entered Gemini, or Mithuna. And when it entered Gemini just after midnight Eastern time today, this morning, that means that 6 planets are in their own sign. They call that Swa in Vedic astrology. That's a Sanskrit name for a planet being in its own sign. July 4th, so in a couple days through July 29th, Mercury is going to go combust, or Asta. So Mercury is going to be combust most of the month. July 12th, Saturn goes retrograde into Capricorn, so it's switching signs. Capricorn is called Makara in Sanskrit. And when Saturn goes backwards, it's going to be aspecting Ketu, which I'll talk about more. On July 13th, there's going to be a full moon in Sagittarius in Uttarashada, the nakshatra or lunar mansion called Uttarashada. And on the same day, Venus will enter Gemini. And when it does so, it's going to be ending 5 planets being Swa, or in their own sign. On July 16th, Sun and Mercury are entering Cancer, within a few hours of each other. Cancer is called Karka in Sanskrit. And when they move, they're going to be ending 4 planets being Swa, in their own sign. On July 28th, there's going to be a new moon in Cancer in the nakshatra Pushami. Saturn is ending its Sandhi period. Sandhi means planets in the first or last degree of a sign. That makes it unstable because it's changing energies. And Jupiter goes retrograde all on July 28th. On July 30th through the 2nd of August, Mars will be in an exact conjunction with Rahu, the north node of the moon, in Misha, or Aries, and that will aspect Ketu with Saturn. And that also ends 3 planets being Swa in their own sign. And then on the last day of the month, Mercury enters Leo. So, that may not mean a lot to you, but I'm going to go through each sort of transit here and what that may mean. The other thing to note is that in Vedic astrology, we generally emphasize slow-moving planets, which are Jupiter, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. And as I go through this, you might think, oh, that sort of looks like my chart. But every chart is different based on very minute details and also what planetary period you're going through. So just because you see something in somebody else's chart, it may not necessarily apply to you. So keep that in mind. Alright, so first up we have today, July 2nd, 6 planets, or grahas, will be Swa, or in their own sign. And it started at 12:15 this morning, and it's going to be going till 9 o'clock this evening, Eastern Standard Time. So when a planet is Swa, or in its own sign, this makes planets stronger. It gives it strength because it's sort of like being in your own house. When you're in your own house, you're in your comfort zone, and you don't have to sort of watch your manners, so to speak. You can just sort of fully be yourself. So planets are stronger, and they tend to be well behaved, even if they're what we consider malevolent planets. So when you have 6 planets that are in their own sign, generally this is considered an auspicious time, but there are caveats to this. And I think the biggest caveat is that when planets are in their own sign, it may not necessarily be good for living beings, issues related to living beings, or medical issues. And you might look at my June transit video because I talked about things like Jupiter being in its own sign, especially when it's related to the fifth house, because the fifth house is children. Jupiter represents children. And when you have Jupiter in its own sign in the fifth house, it may look sort of superficially or at first glance like, oh, wow, that's great. Jupiter is the great benefic and it's in its own sign and it's in the sign of children. That's all lovely, but sometimes there can be too much energy there. So that kind of phenomenon is called Bargo Karko Nasha. That's just one example of how a Swa planet may not be actually that great. But, there's going to be a lot of goodness right now. So, people might kind of be feeling like it's a little bit of a honeymoon period, actually. And so I took a picture here of, let's see, today, and the rising sign is Virgo. Rising sign, you can also say Lugna or Ascendant. So the rising sign is Virgo, and I took this snap right when Mercury, which switched signs, and that's what created the sixth planet Swa situation, entered just past its first degree of Gemini. So it's a little bit more stable because it's not in its Sunday point. Okay. So if we look at this, sky pattern, almost as if it was somebody's chart. Again, Virgo is the Lugna, rising sign ascendant. Those are all basically words that mean the same thing. And so for somebody who has a Virgo ascendant, that would basically mean that they have a lot of good energy in their work sector, their work house, their money house, and also the house that represents the self. And the reason why is because we have, if we look at the work house is the 10th house, and that's where Mercury has just entered. So Mercury is in its own sign. So for somebody with a Virgo Lugna, there's probably something good happening around work. And if we look at why is money on the list here, well, because the 11th house, which is where the moon is, you can see moon is circled here, it's in its own sign, and the 11th house represents things like income and groups, clubs, societies, that sort of thing. So probably socializing and income are going to be good. But again, if we remember this caveat about living beings, groups, clubs, societies may not be working that well for everybody, but money's probably good, income's probably good. And then the self. So the reason why the self is doing well here is because Jupiter's in its own sign and it's directly aspecting the rising sign or Virgo here. Okay, so you can see all the circled planets here. All the circled planets are all Swa, they're all in their own sign. So Saturn is in its own sign, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Venus, Moon. So the only planets that are not in their own sign at the moment are Rahu, Ketu, the north and south node of the moon, and Sun. Okay. So, so again, if this was somebody has a Virgo Lugna right now, again, work, money, self, you might be feeling pretty good about those issues. But there may be possible issues here because Saturn is in its own sign in the 6th house, but it's in 28 minutes. It's just about to leave Aquarius and go back into Capricorn. That's a bit unstable, and it's a malevolent planet. The 6th house can represent things like employees and enemies, so there might be issues there. And let's see, then we have Mars and Rahu in the 8th house. That can represent like your partner's or your spouse's family, and those will aspect directly into the 2nd house. The 2nd house represents the family of origin. So either way, it's either the family you came from or the family you're kind of marrying into. There can be issues there. And then the thing is that Saturn aspects into the 12th house of like loss and isolation, expenditures. So these malevolent planets for a Virgo Lagna, not every rising sign, but for a Virgo Lagna, they're all going to be touching 3 negative houses in the chart. So even though work and money might be working well for a Virgo rising person, there might be health issues about to come into being, if not already on the table. And the thing here too is that Rahu, sometimes people take Rahu has certain aspects into other houses. So I take Rahu to aspect into the 5th house away and the 9th house away if it's reflecting on its dispositor. So dispositor means the lord of the house that it's in. So it happens to be in Aries, and Aries, the ruler of Aries, the lord of Aries is Mars, so it's sitting there with Mars. So what that means is you can actually take this energy here and reflect it from the 8th house for a Virgo Lagna, 5 houses away into Leo, and then 9 houses away into Jupiter. So those areas might be affected again for Virgo. And again, you can shift all these things depending on your rising sign, but again, the house meanings are going to change, right? So the other thing is that Saturn, in this, even though it's swa and it's retrograde, so it has some strength, and that helps it out, tends to straighten Saturn out as much as it can. It's still in the Sunday point, and it's just about to switch into Capricorn, so it's still unstable. And Saturn aspects 3 houses away. So Saturn and the sort of instability that it has right now is reflecting on Mars and Rahu. So basically there's a conjunction. You can kind of think of it as a conjunction or a blending or integration of Saturnian energy with Mars and Rahu that's going to be affecting the houses, especially for a Virgo Lagna, the negative houses. Yeah. So again, take this into consideration. You can potentially adjust this for your own rising sign. And even if you adjust it for your own rising sign, you may not be going through similar planetary periods, and even like a minute or two can change things depending on the sub-zodiacs of your chart. So just keep that in mind. But again, most people are going to say, oh, it's a great time, 6 planets, la-di-da. So enjoy the goodness that it brings, because it will bring some goodness, but it may not be all good. Okay, so just try to keep that balanced perspective would be my advice. So transit dates. Let's talk about Mercury, Venus, and Sun next. So July 4th in a couple days through almost the end of July, Mercury's going to go combust. In Sanskrit they call it asta. So what that means is that Mercury is so close to the Sun that it basically gets eclipsed by the Sun's light. So you can't see Mercury in the sky anymore when Mercury is this close to the Sun. And combustion, the quality of combustion when a planet goes into combustion is that the qualities of the planets, the qualities associated with planets, go more internal, because you can't see them outwardly, just like you can't outwardly see Mercury when it's high in the sky so close to the Sun. It gets, again, eclipsed by the Sun. So combustion is generally thought to be a primary weakness, so it makes Mercury weaker. Okay, and also because of this combustion aspect and not being able to see Mercury, you literally may not end up seeing people that tend to be represented by the combusted planet. So, because again, the outward manifestation, the qualities of that planet and the things that it represents are not outwardly manifested because they're eclipsed by the Sun. And this relates to, they call this the Jiva Karaka, so the living kind of symbolism of the planet. So different planets will represent different people. So in terms of the qualities and people that Mercury represents the intellect, rationality, the analytical mind, decision-making, communication. So it's very heady. And people that Mercury represents are aunts and uncles, friends, business-related people, so like customers, coworkers, and also teammates, because Mercury's related to games and stuff like that. So during this combust period, you might internally go deeper within yourself to kind of think through things, kind of analyze things and make some decisions, but it's going to be on the internal level. And again, some of these people, aunts, uncles, friends, your customers, teammates, you may not see for a few weeks, and that might be a little bit like, like, oh, they're going to go on vacation. It might just seem like they're going on vacation, but it's like you won't see them the way you might normally. Yeah. Okay. So that's Mercury for that's the condition of Mercury most of the month. On July 13th, Venus enters Gemini. So when Venus enters Gemini, it's leaving Taurus, its own sign. So we're going to go from 5 planets Swa are in their own sign to 4 on that day, because Venus is leaving its own sign. It is going into a friendly sign. Venus likes Mercury governed signs. And being in a friendly sign gives a planet a certain amount of strength, not as much as a primary strength, but what we would consider a secondary strength. So it's helpful. Not hugely helpful, but helpful nonetheless. And then Gemini and Sun are going to be there. So when you think about Venus and Mercury together, Venus represents things like arts and beauty and sensuality, kind of the finer things in life. And Gemini, again, it represents the intellect and the analytical mind. So when you cross these two things, the intellect with arts, you get things like museums and languages and novels and that sort of thing, of a high grade or high quality. So those sorts of things might be, in the picture coming July 13th. And then on July 16th, Sun and Mercury are both leaving Gemini and entering Cancer or Karka. And this is going to end the 4 planets Swa. So at that point, only 3 planets are going to be in their own sign. So you could see, like, slowly over the month, like even if you're feeling like riding the high now, slowly over the month as one planet leaves their sign after the next, that energy is going to diminish a little bit. So the thing, though, is that because Mercury is such a heady intellectual sign, and Venus is more of the kind of sensual planet and sort of the beauty planet and that sort of thing, there's going to be this shift from the intellect to emotions. And also as you move from Mercury, or Gemini, the sign of Gemini, which is a very heady intellectual sign, to Cancer, which is a water sign, it's an emotional sign, you're going to shift from intellect to more of an emotional space, shift from head to heart. Okay, so you're probably feeling that on some level. And then on July 31st, Mercury's going to enter Leo, or it's called Simha in Sanskrit. Leo is a fire sign, or Rashi, and Leo, it's more of an extroverted vibe. It's going to be more out there. It's going to be less the energy, kind of flowing through this month. Especially, it's basically going to be a Mercury sort of journey this month. There's going to be more of an extroverted vibe, and Leo also represents things like high places, not just like high, like a mountaintop high, but well-to-do places, and even things like stages. So if you take all this together, then there are a couple of storylines, for example, that can come through this Mercury journey through the course of July. So it could be somebody who take some time off, get a little quiet, and they might journal or write some lyrics or something, set it to music as the Venus energy comes through, and then once Mercury goes into Leo, presents it somewhere like on a stage or something like that. So that could be one storyline for somebody. Another example of this Mercury journey through July could be a friend or colleague, again, Mercury, takes some time off for a retreat or sabbatical, goes combust, returns with an announcement about some decision that they made. So returns with an announcement, that's Leo and Mercury combined. And then again, Mercury is about decision making. So it's about going within, discovering something, getting some epiphany, some insight, and so the thinking process, again, allows the emotions, the true emotions, true feelings to sort of bubble up, and then you get an integration before it's sort of presented outwardly. Right, so that's the Mercury journey for July. So let's talk about the moon now. On July 13th, there's going to be a full moon in Sagittarius, or Danu. The moon in general. So I mentioned Mercury. Mercury is the rational, analytical, decision-making brain. The moon, though, is like the whole mind. It's the thoughts, it's the feelings, it's the senses, it's the intuition. It's like it's the big sweeper of all impressions, internal and external. It takes everything in. But what Mercury does is it processes all the stuff that the mind's taking in, and then it makes decisions about what to do with it. So the moon and Mercury are both related to the mind, but in very different capacities. There's going to be a full moon on the 13th, and when the moon is full, it's considered to have a primary strength, so it's going to be stronger. And when it's full of light, with any planet's full of light, it tends to be stronger and more benevolent in nature. Especially with the moon is kind of a juicy planet, because again, you have not just thoughts, but you have feelings and senses and intuition. And it's also going to be in the Sagittarius, which is a fire action sign. Sagittarius tends to be sort of a philosophical or cause-driven type of sign. And so during full moons, this can also bring, emotions and insights to the surface. So this actually folds in pretty well with this whole Mercury journey that I mentioned on the previous slide. And for this full moon, it's going to be happening in Uttara Ashada Nakshatra. So Nakshatra is a lunar mansion. There are 27 lunar mansions. So if you kind of take the 360-degree view of the sky and divide it up into 27 bits, each one has a different name and has a different energy. So it's going to be an Uttarashada. The symbol of Uttarashada is a tusk of an elephant. So again, since this is traditional ancient Indian astrology, elephants are typically associated with the god Ganesha, who has a head of an elephant, and he symbolizes new beginnings and the removal of obstacles for permanent success. And because of the tusk, it's like great insight, great piercing, right? So again, this all is correlation of this idea with Mercury moving through Gemini, the moon being full in Uttarashada. Like again, there's probably going to be some emotional shift or mental shift, release, breakthrough, insight. Yeah, that's coming. And again, with this Uttarashada Nakshatra energy, there's a sense of righteousness and virtue. So it's a positive sign, or nakshatra. And it's similar to Purvashada, that's a lunar mansion just before it. And the energy of that nakshatra is like, Uttarashada is more introspective and gentle. Purvashada, though, the symbol of that nakshatra is a fan or a winnowing basket. So a winnowing basket is where you take like wheat, for example, and you kind of shift it around, and it helps to remove the husk. So it's this kind of idea of like a slow process to remove the grain from the chaff. So you're removing like the rough bits to create something more digestible and useful. So again, the moon was just going through Purvashada before it lands in Uttarashada for the full moon. And so there's more correlation here that again there's going to be this sort of mental churning to help release and remove the rough bits that may not be so useful. Okay. So then on July 28th, there's going to be a new moon in Cancer. So the moon's going to go the 180 degrees to the opposite sign, or the opposite place of where it was. It's going to end up in Cancer or Karka. So a new moon is considered a primary weakness because it's right next to the sun. You can almost think of a new moon as an eclipse of the moon. And again, when the moon is eclipsed, or any planet's eclipsed, you can't see it, there's no light, because the sun is outshining it. And so it causes a bit of weakness. People can get more internal. They might feel a little bit more kind of sensitive or fragile during new moons. And Cancer, again, is a water sign, emotional sign. It's very home and relationship oriented. So having this new moon can actually bring closure or emotional release to situations. in Western astrology, they call the few days before the new moon, they call it a balsamic moon, so like a sweet vinegar, bittersweetness. And it's this bittersweetness of sort of letting go of old stuff, old ideas, paradigms, feelings, or whatever. And by letting go of the old stuff, even though there might be a few tears associated with it or some emotional, high charged emotions, you're basically clearing out old energies to allow space for new experiences, new feelings, better situations to come in. This new moon in Cancer on the 28th is going to be happening in Pushami Nakshatra, or Pusha Nakshatra, that lunar mansion. The symbol of Pusha is a cow's udder. So you might think of this as like a very nourishing energy and charitable energy. The reason why it's considered charitable is because, especially in India, cows are really revered, and the reason why is because they're so generous with their milk is that they're willing to donate it to other species. So like the sweet cow, potentially is giving us milk because we're a bunch of orphaned humans who don't have our own mother's milk available to us. So, again, you can get into a debate about nutrition. There are all these ideas about the nutrition of milk and whether it's good for you or whatever. But just so you understand that, why cows are revered to some extent and why the symbolism of this nakshatra is what it is. Just a little background there. So even if there's a malefic planet in Pusha, the negative effects of that planet tend to be softened. So it tends to be kind of like you might outwardly have this sort of hard surface, but inwardly you're going to be more nurturing, just like a crab shell, which, in Western astrology, Cancer is symbolized by a crab, right? So, and this nakshatra is also related to speech and wisdom and spirituality, because the governing planet of this nakshatra is Jupiter, and Jupiter is associated with those things. So things like purity and truth are related to this nakshatra as well. It's considered a very auspicious planet. Nakshatra. So again, there's again, it's not unrelated to Uttarashada, which I just talked about. So that energy is prevalent on both sides of the cycle of the moon this month. Let's see, and I'm going to talk about Jupiter next, but again, this is all correlating with the Mercury journey here, right? Going inward, release, epiphanies, insights coming forward, yeah? So you're kind of seeing how all these energies are sort of stacking up. Okay, so Jupiter on the 28th of July, Jupiter doing retrograde or Vakri, and it will be retrograde until the 23rd of November, so a good, 5 months or so? 4 months, 5 months? Because it's in its own sign, it's in Pisces, which it rules, so it has one primary strength, and when, again, planets go retrograde, that's the second primary strength. So it's got two primary strengths. Jupiter's like super, super strong right now. So again, that's generally good news because Jupiter's considered the great benefic. But again, you got to remember that caveat about non-living things, right? So the other thing is that this super, super strong Jupiter is aspecting all this stuff with Mercury, Moon, and Sun in Cancer, and Jupiter happens to be exalted in Cancer. So, it's almost like a 2.5 times primary strength. You got a lot of benefic energy on this Mercury, Moon, Sun combination in Cancer. So that's potentially really great for a lot of things, especially because Jupiter, again, is a great benefic. It's considered a sattvic planet or spiritual planet. And the thing about it is that even if this arrangement in your particular chart during whatever planetary period you happen to be going through, there may be some upset, or something negative that happens, at least something that you perceive as negative. But because Jupiter's so strong, there's going to be a bit of a protective effect, and protective not in the way that like the event will not happen, but with all this Jupiterian energy, you'll be better able to create positive meaning out of this event, like in the end, the outcome, like even if in the beginning it seems like a big storm, unwanted storm, the outcome will smooth out and there will be a silver lining. Or you may be able to see like a greater opportunity or the greater picture here, rather than just like, the loss in the moment. So this might be something like, nobody really wants to lose a child, but let's say somebody did, and you have to work through all that grief and sadness and loss and the, surprise and the frustration. I mean, all those emotions. But it may be like this kind of situation might be the kind of thing where somebody who loses a child ends up creating a foundation that helps many, many other children moving forward, and it creates a new life direction and purpose for them. So, again, even if there's an upset, Jupiter saves things in that sort of way. Now, this chart here, I took a snap of. This is, when is this going to be? This is going to be later in the month. So I think this is on July 28th, thereabouts. I gotta check my notes on that. But anyway, I oriented this so that Scorpio was in the Lagna or in the rising sign. Is the rising sign here. So, similarly for people who are Scorpio rising, there might be some relationship, not entirely, again, everybody's different, but Cancer is the 9th house for a Scorpio Lagna. The 9th house, or Bhava, represents things like government, religion, fathers. So you're going to have all this Jupiterian energy also like shedding its light on this Cancer 9th Bhava, 9th house of the Scorpio Lagna. So, I don't know if you got a chance to look at my June 2022 transit videos. So the transit video I did last month where I went really deep into where Jupiter is right now and how it's associated with so many like children's issues in the United States. But the reason why I chose Scorpio Lagna rising here was because the USA chart, natal chart, is a Scorpio rising. So you can this is kind of like a transit chart for the United States. But what this makes me think of when I see the planets this way, especially for the United States, it makes me think that because Jupiter represents things like philosophy and law and justice and that sort of thing, it's aspecting into the 9th house. The 9th house represents government, religion, fathers. And again, there's this whole like Mercury, Moon, Epiphany story, like, churning as well. It makes me think that like the philosophical under kind of basis of things that have recently happened, like the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which concerns abortion rights in the United States, which was a law that was like 50 years old and it got overturned and that sort of thing. And apparently, I think it's like 70% of the United States doesn't agree with it, but the Supreme Court of the United States ran that way with it just last week or so. This makes me think things like, because Jupiter is aspecting into the 9th house of government, clearly government's involved, but even like father and religion's involved, but also fathers, this gives me the impression that it might be time to shift the conversation about these sorts of issues from being like, it's mostly, I see it mostly written about as like women's rights and that sort of thing. And the philosophical change here may be something like that that men generally step in and step up in different ways to make it more than like a women's rights issue, because especially most societies about 50% women and men and that sort of thing. And it might be that like I could see in many ways how men feel left out of that conversation, like they don't have a right to have an opinion. And it might be time to really incorporate that, because again, if it's just women fighting for this, and fighting in a certain direction, it's always going to be teeter-tottering, 50-50. But if it's a conversation issue that, it becomes more of like a family issue, that sort of thing, and especially if 70% of the population wants something like Roe versus Wade, then again, I think it becomes a different conversation, a different issue, and it would potentially more reflect what most people want. But again, that's just one example. It may not pan out that way, but I could see how these energies for like the United States can pan out this way, or something similar. Again, similar strains or themes run through for somebody with the Scorpio Lugna. Again, not saying that Roe versus Wade should or should not be moved forward or backward or anything like that. I'm just talking about how the energies themselves may play out by the end of the month. So the other big thing, so I've mostly been talking about, sort of starting off the month with 6 planets SWA in their own sign. Again, this is sort of the honeymoon period. That starts to wane week by week as the planets move on. And you get some benefit, you get this positive energy, epiphany energy coming from Mercury and Moon with some support from Jupiter. But don't forget, like, there are other planets here, and it's almost like this quiet sort of gathering as this other stuff is going on, that the malevolent planets actually are starting to converge and conjoin. So let me talk about that. So on July 12th, Saturn retrogrades into Capricorn. Gochara is the name for it in Sanskrit. It will be in Capricorn until 17th of January 2023. So it's going to be there for 6 months. And Saturn is SWA in either sign. It owns both Aquarius and Capricorn, so it's strong in either one. But they're different energies. So Aquarius is more of an air sign. It's more about thinking. Capricorn is more of an earth sign, so it's more pragmatic. It's more about doing. So it's going to be, kind of shifting from thinking and ideology to how do we make this work on the ground, whatever the issue is. The other thing is that when Saturn makes a shift into Capricorn, it's going to aspect K2, the south node of the moon, which happens to be in Libra right now. And the thing is, K2 is a, malevolent planet, and it's already being aspected by Mars. So there's a lot of kind of negative energy kind of brewing and kind of gathering energy here in Libra with K2 and Mars aspecting it, and soon to be Saturn as well. On July 27th, Saturn ends Sunday. So again, it gets out of this first or last degree of a sign. That makes it more stable. Because again, when you shift signs, it makes any planet unstable. Which is good because of what's coming. At least Saturn will be a little bit more stable instead of less stable. And you'll have, again, that Jupiter shining on some houses and planets in the chart. But on July 30th through August 2nd, Mars is going to be in exact conjunction with Rahu, which is in Aries or Misha. And again, there's going to be this conjoining of energies. Mars is going to be aspecting K2 with Saturn moving in, so those two planets are aspecting K2. And it's going to end the situation of 3 planets SWA. Okay, so what does this look like? Alright, so let's take a look at a chart here. This chart is from July 30th, 2022 at 17:21 Eastern Standard Time. This is again a Scorpio Lugna, because I wanted to kind of, since we just talked about the USA natal chart, this lines up with that. In any case, what we see here. So let's look at the red arrows first. You can see down in the lower left corner in the 6th house is Mars and Rahu. Okay, and this is going to be the exact conjunction at the end of the month. So Mars is just about to go into the same degree as Rahu. Okay, Mars aspects 4 houses away, 7 houses away, and 8 houses away. So those are the arrows. So what that means is Mars projects its energy onto Cancer, onto Libra, onto Scorpio. Okay, so if it happens, you happen to have a Scorpio Lugna, this is going to aspect into your 9th house, your 12th house, and your 1st house. Okay, that's the Mars energy there. Okay, now if we look at the yellow energy, the yellow arrows, that's Jupiter in its own sign, retrograde. We talked about how strong that is, and we talked about how that, if you follow the yellow arrow right, you'll see that aspecting into Cancer, helping out Mercury and Sun there. We talked about that. Because Jupiter has an aspect, it aspects 5 houses away. It also aspects 9 houses away. So you're also going to get this Jupiterian energy in Scorpio, which for Scorpio Lugna is going to be the first house. The first house represents the self and general health, that sort of thing. So you're going to have this Mars energy. Luckily, Mars for Scorpio Lugna, since Scorpio is ruled by Mars, Mars will help protect the non-living things of a Scorpio Lugna when it aspects this way, and then Jupiter is going to help it out, so that's great in terms of the first house for non-living things for a Scorpio Lugna. And then we have Saturn here, so you can see for a Scorpio Lugna again, Saturn is in the 3rd house. It's retrograde in its own sign, very strong. It's out of Sundi, so out of the last degree, so it's stable here. Saturn aspects 3 houses away, so it's going to be projecting its energy onto Jupiter in Pisces. It's going to be projecting its energy onto Cancer, so it's going to be affecting all the stuff going on there. And it's going to be projecting its energy 10 houses away, so again on this K2 that's up in the 12th house for the Scorpio Lugna. Okay, so red arrows is Mars energy, yellow arrows is Jupiter energy, and Saturn is the blue arrows, Saturnian energy. All right, so what do these planets represent? Saturn represents things like structure, old things, the ground, actual land, being grounded. It's like slow development, that sort of thing. It can represent things like chronic illness, isolation, and separation as well. Okay, and then Mars can represent things like acute illness, inflammation, surgery, sudden starts, and it can also represent land and property. Actually, Saturn and Mars both represent property or land. So Mars is a very sudden, fiery planet, and Saturn is like the slow, infrastructure building. Rahu and Ketu, the north and south node of the moon, they represent things that are hidden, unexpected, unusual, bizarre even. So if we're looking at a Scorpio Lugna, most of this energy, the malevolent energy that's sort of gathering up at the end of the month, that's going to kind of be sparked off by this conjunction of Mars and Rahu on July 30th or so. For a Scorpio Lugna, it's going to be on the 6-12 axis. So the 6th house and the 12th house are mostly going to be affected by this. Because again, Jupiter is going to protect to some degree Cancer, where Mars is projecting energy, and it's also going to be protecting Scorpio because it's projecting energy. But there's no protection in Aries, and there's no real protection in Libra. Aries is a little bit different because you don't have Saturn aspecting energy there. So it's going to be a little bit lighter, just a bit, tad, smidge. The other thing is that even though Mars is conjunct with Rahu, it's in Aries, its own sign. So there will be some protection of non-living things again. But still probably not great. Probably not the best energy, at least with living beings and living things. So what does the 6-12 axis represent? The 6th house, or 6th bhava, represents things like acute illnesses, enemies, and debts. And the 12th house represents things like expenditures, loss, foreign, or isolated places. Isolated places could be something like prison, it could be a hospital, it could be a temple, place of worship, that sort of thing. Foreign land. So if we put this all together for a Scorpio Lugna, I could see like three kind of scenarios going on. So, with this whole kind of medical thing, chronic illness, inflammation, hidden, isolated places, in the 6th house of acute injuries and illness, and the 12th house of loss and isolated places. This could be something like a virus flare-up, whether it's like another COVID wave that's coming for the United States. It could also be the monkeypox. They're seeing some, newer news about, a new virus that, sort of on the radar for public health. It could be something like this. So it might be that there's actually another wave of that sort of thing going on at the end of the month. It kind of, gets flared up. So another scenario for all this energy could be that there's, especially if we're thinking about this in terms of like the United States, this could be something like an intervention overseas involving land. That's going to be pretty expensive because again, we've got all this energy in the 12th house, for Scorpio, Lugna, United States. So it could be something like that. The third possible scenario could be something like land destruction, because Saturn and Mars, as I mentioned, represent things like ground, property. Also, when you get Saturn and Mars together, that can represent things like engineering, so there can be re-engineering. And again, with the Rahu-Ketu energy, there's this sudden, unexpected, surprising type stuff. So it might be something, unfortunately, like some sort of land destruction, especially in the northeast of the country, because the 12th house is located in the north, what's considered sort of the northeast portion of a chart. So those are just a few examples of how these energies might play out for the United States, and or similar theme for somebody with a Scorpio Lugna through July. So what does this conjunction mean if you don't have a Scorpio Lugna? So let me just go through briefly. Again, everybody's going to be different, so keep that in mind. And you may not be going through a planetary period that's going to highlight this, so keep that in mind. But if we just very, very briefly look at kind of the houses and orientations of different rising signs. So if you happen to be an Aries or Libra rising sign, this whole Saturn, Mars, Rahu, Ketu conjunction business is going to be happening on the 1-7 axis. So the first house is self and health, and the 7th house is relationships and independent business. So you might see some of this energy playing out there. If you happen to be a Taurus or Scorpio rising, Lugna, ascendant, all this conjunction business is going to be happening on the 6-12 axis for you. So the 6th house represents debts and enemies, and the 12th house represents losses and isolation. So we talked about Scorpio, but Taurus is the opposite sign, so it's going to be on the other side of all this, yeah. So they're going to be feeling it similarly, but differently, too. There's going to be a reflection there anyway. So for Gemini and Sagittarius, this is all going to be happening on the 5-11 axis. 5th house represents children, creativity. The 11th house represents things like groups and income. If you're Cancer, Capricorn, rising, Lugna, ascendant, this is going to be happening on the 4-10 axis for you. So the 4th house represents home. The 10th house represents career. Leo and Aquarius, this is going to be happening on the 3-9 axis for you. The 3rd house represents things like siblings and communication. The 9th house represents fathers, religion, higher education. So there might be just some disruptions there. Virgo and Pisces, this is going to be happening on the 2-8 axis for you. So the 2nd house represents family of origin and beginnings of things. And the 8th house represents the spouse's family or partner's family and endings of things. So, the sudden kind of re-engineering can happen in different areas of life depending on your rising sign. And again, always, every planet, even if for some people, Jupiter, even though it's called the Great Benefic, for some people it might actually cause harm, depending on where it's located and what nakshatra is in and what other planets are on it. So you got to take this all with a grain of salt. So there you have it, the transits for the month and how the planetary energies are, potentially going to manifest themselves and show up in our lives. So again, for the month of July, think we're going to start off well, some pretty fluffy, warm, fun energy. But it's going to go internal. We're going to do some thinking and processing and come back with something. And what's interesting to me is that we're going to come back with these epiphanies, with this like emotional release, with this sort of cleansing of the palate, emotional and mental palate, just in time, like to sort of deal with whatever might come about with this end of the month conjunction with Saturn, Mars, Rahu, and Ketu. So it kind of like, in my mind, it's almost like one of those movies where the superhero, it's all good because the villain isn't being that active, and then they kind of take some time out and they kind of retreat a bit, go within, and they kind of reestablish like why they do what they do, or they get reconfirmed to what they do, that sort of thing. And just as they reemerge, it's a good thing that they emerge when they do, because then, the villains are sort of back in play. And again, villain, that can be a little bit of a harsh term, because again, even villains, right? Even negative events, negative people, that sort of thing, they all have the potential to bring out better qualities within us, which is really I think, highest ideal of life, and also astrology. So, in any case, I hope all this gave you some insights and thoughts about the coming month, and can help light your path along the way. I want to thank you for your time, and until the next one, take care.